wonder what it would be like to be the citizen of a serious country, to have actual national identity, to have national pride, to look at our history and see serious decisions were made for us, knowing that people coming in the future would have a secure future. And to be able to look at my fellow countrymen in government work, in the public sector, in the armed forces, and know that they are doing their level best to keep our country moving forward. Unfortunately, I'm from Malawi, so here's the thing. I can honestly say that there are a lot of great Malawians. There are great people from our country. But our country, Malawi, is not a great country. How did we end up with M-Dub messed up? The truth of it is, an institution, whether we're talking about a family, whether we're talking about a village, a town, a country, whenever an institution is rotten, it's because the people within it have become rotten. And the people that are participating are either part of the rot or they stand by and allow the rot to fester. They don't do anything. And that's what's happened with Malawi. It's not just the government, it's the people. And I know it's the people because if you look at certain circumstances where the people could solve a problem without government intervention, we don't. Look at the situation in Sanje. They're talking about how drought is affecting farming over there. Like farmers can't plant because there's no rains. Sanje is a district with two major rivers running through it. And some of these people are going into the river to pick these funny, I don't know what, this like a potato that grows underwater, risking being bitten by crocodiles, being eaten by crocodiles and all that. Rather than getting a shovel or getting a few people with some shovels, digging a ditch or a canal that connects the river to the farmland, that doesn't require government intervention. Irrigation is an ancient technology. It was there in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt. But for some reason, what's happened with the situation in Sanje, the same thing in Machinga here, where people are going without planting, or their crops are damaged because they haven't done any irrigation. They're relying on rain, or they're waiting for the government or for US aid or some organization to come and do this stuff for them. And here's the thing, it doesn't require that much of an investment. It's just some shovels and some people. You don't really need the piping and all these things that people want. This is another thing, like people want to start at level 10 rather than level 1. You're on 0, you want to be getting the tech from level 10 that you can't afford, rather than just starting from level 1 where you can afford it, where you don't need intervention from another like international body or the government. So this attitude is also present in Sanje. There are people there that wait on government handouts. They wait for maize from the government. They wait for donations. There's very few people that are willing to get up and do things on their own. So that's one of the attitude issues. One of the other issues we have is we don't like to be held accountable. I was watching one of these African channels documenting what's going on with the migrant workers going to Israel. Malawian migrant workers going to work on farms in Israel, and they're suffering in terrible conditions and all this. I mean, we saw this from the start. If you read the contracts, you knew they were going to have a terrible time there. But when international observers mention these things. I was seeing these comments from Malawi saying, "Stay out of our business. How dare you talk about us? Oh, why don't you mind your own country?" And you're like, bruh, like, so no one else is allowed to have an opinion on how things are going in Malawi? What, like, you yourself know that it's not great, but if someone mentions it, there's an issue. Like, I keep on saying, we're in the situation we're in because we want to be. At this level, at this rate, if you keep on having these failures, it's a choice. There's no way it's not a choice. We're in this position because we want to be in it. And I'm quite frankly tired of talking about Malawi because I can see that people want to continue living this way and they want things to they want the status quo to be maintained. If they didn't, then it would have changed by now. If you really wanted change, it would have already happened. There's a few people who might want it, but I don't think the majority of the country actually wants any kind of change. Otherwise, the change would have already come. You know, people talk about, you have ideas, you should go do this, you're the one with the ideas. How come you're not like, bruh, I'm not the only one who thinks like this. There's several people, but there has to be the will. An idea alone is not enough. There has to be popular will for something to take place. Because one person like me could go in, but if there's 2,000 corrupt people in the institution, they'll just have you killed. They'll just get rid of you. They might not necessarily have you killed, but they'll get rid of you. So that's not really the solution. It has to take collective will for any change to actually happen.
The Reserve Bank of Malawi increased their policy rate by 200 basis points, which is fancy speak for 2%, from 24% to 26%. What is the policy rate? That is the rate at which they lend to other financial institutions. So they've increased the cost of borrowing to other financial institutions. What that tends to do is it also has a knock-on effect on consumers. So the cost of borrowing from a commercial bank will increase because they pass on the cost to the consumer or to the private lender or to even commercial lenders. So companies, businesses, individuals, the cost of borrowing to them increases. Why does a central bank do this? In theory, it's supposed to cool down inflation. So it's supposed to reduce inflation if you increase your interest rate by a degree greater than the rate of inflation has increased. So if inflation increases by 3%, if you increase your interest rate by 4%, in theory, it's supposed to cool down inflation. Now, this tends to work in economies with well-developed financial systems. So you've got really big, really advanced financial institutions and a financial market that really works. You have typically a great manufacturing industry, a lot of services going on, a well-developed economy. The majority of the population is in urban areas, and the majority of the population has access to capital, and people buy things on credit. So typically what happens when the interest rate increases in an economy like that is people will borrow less because the cost of borrowing has increased. And because so much of the demand in the market, the aggregate demand, is based on consumer spending as well as business spending that is financed by credit, it cools the economy down, so it reduces aggregate demand. There's less aggregate demand, less demand in the economy. That brings prices down, and in that way, increasing the interest rate decreases inflation. That's in theory. Now, an economy like Malawi, where you've got a huge rural population, most of them do not demand things on credit. You've also got a very poor or underdeveloped financial sector that is crowded out by the government, because the government is the main borrower in the country. Is increasing the interest rate, the policy rate, going to cool down the economy? Is it going to reduce aggregate demand? No, because most of the demand, in terms of the lending, most of the borrowing is done by the government, and the government is not going to reduce their spending. Government spending in Malawi never reduces. In fact, increasing the interest rate only increases the costs of borrowing to the government. The government continues borrowing, so it's increasing the cost to government. And how do they make up for that? They increase taxes in order to pay off their loans. So what does that end up doing? It doesn't decrease inflation. In fact, it exacerbates inflation in the country. It's crazy, ain't it? Side note, doing dishes is the most bizarre household chore. I live with my wife. It's just my wife and I, the two of us. We have like 4 forks, but somehow when I do the dishes, there's like 12. I'm like, how does this happen? Did our neighbors come through and have a kitchen party while I was asleep or something? Like, how? How does it happen? Strange.
We all know the country is going through a forex crisis. In response to this, the government has decided to devalue the currency. Devaluation, in theory, is supposed to make your goods more attractive. So domestic goods become more attractive to foreign purchasers. So you export more and you import less, because imports have become more expensive to domestic buyers. So you're supposed to have a better balance of trade once that happens, in theory. However, that theory is dependent on the country having a net export elasticity of demand coefficient that is greater than 1. So that means that your prices, the price of exports and imports is elastic. So there is an actual response in changes in demand to price. So, for example, if we devalue the currency, imports become more expensive, the domestic market has to be very reactive to that, so it imports far less. And at the same time, the foreign market, the global market, needs to be receptive to that change in price as well and demand more. And the coefficient should be greater than 1. Unfortunately, we have a price inelastic. It's in inelasticity when it comes to imports and exports, net exports, because we are a country that is dependent on imports. So we keep importing things because we need them. Pretty much everything in the country is imported, even the raw materials to produce the goods that we produce. And we don't export anything besides sugar and tobacco. So these are also things that are not in vogue, they're not necessities, so they're not going to have a great value, and not great volumes of it will be exported. We don't manufacture enough, and we basically don't have enough exports to take advantage of a devaluation. And the reason we're going to have chronic forex shortages is because we don't export enough. The value of a currency is really a reflection of the demand for that country's goods. The dollar is strong because, again, American goods are valued across the world. Their services, mostly, like their banking services, things like Apple, like there's a bunch of things that are American made, or at least the brand is American. So the dollar will always have some value like that. The same goes for the pound or the euro. China artificially keeps its currency down, like they keep their currency a little bit deflated because they want to always have exports. Same goes for Japan. So a currency is a reflection of the demand for that country's goods, and we don't produce anything, and because we always import things, we need things from other countries. There's always going to be that balance of trade deficit, and there's always going to be a forex shortage because we don't produce anything. So that's one of the things that needs to change as well. We need to become a manufacturing society. We need to also provide high value services. However, can this happen with the current tax regime? Because the taxes in Malawi are so high that it chokes out businesses, and government borrowing is also a lot, that it crowds out the private sector. The private sector cannot borrow from the banking institutions, can't take out loans because the government has crowded them out. This happened initially under Bingu's administration, where local government began borrowing from the lending institutions, i.e. banks, and because they were government, it was almost guaranteed that those loans would be paid off, because where's the government going to run away to? It's not like a small mom and pop shop. So the government was always going to guarantee to pay back these loans, and seeing that, the banks decided to start favoring government loans, and those were loans taken by the government, not loans given by the government. And what that did is it crowds out the resources, because the banks are giving up all their cash for these loans, and then the private sector borrowers cannot borrow. There's no money to lend to the private sector, and so the private sector gets crowded out, and then they can't take loans to grow their businesses. So we're stuck in that loop of not being able to export because there's not enough business. The businesses cannot grow because the taxes are too high for even a foreign investor to come in and inject cash, and the banking system is such that they cannot get any loans to become bigger exporters, and we're stuck in that situation where you're not going to have any forex, you're also not going to have any exports. Oh man, it's a tricky situation. It's a tricky one, but it's one that can be solved if we just have people who are willing and able to take the government to task, and people who are actually willing and want to see the country actually change. But I don't think there's enough of those people. But that's just my 2 cents. But yeah, bro, I think I'm pretty much done talking about Malawi on my YouTube page in terms of ways to fix it or whatever, because I'm sure there are people that are smarter than me that are in government positions who know all this stuff, but to make it happen, either they don't want to make it happen because it doesn't serve them, like there's no way for them to make any money off fixing the country, or they are in the system and there are so many roadblocks to fixing things that it's just not worth it. So it probably serves no purpose even talking about it anymore. I would rather just focus on helping people in their private lives on, how to navigate life, navigate business, marketing, finance, and them sort of things, and just make my music as well. Just, make people feel good. So, I think this is probably the last video I'm doing in terms of the Malawian economy in this regard. I might do like educational ones, like just to say what is happening here and there, like how the mechanics work. But in terms of like, oh, we should do this and we should fix that, I'm pretty much done, bro. I'm done. One last thing to mention is this is probably Malawi's last chance to be a serious country. Other developing countries too. The world is moving on. We're moving into AI. We're moving into smarter electronics. We're moving into more energy efficient living. And I don't think that cheap labor can be an advantage, a competitive advantage for much longer that developing countries have. So when the world moves on, that's pretty much it for us. Either we make it now or it's never gonna happen. So I hope you're listening.